UMS Flowell, Sealed Pod Deployment Animation. Here we see the pod sleeve assembly. The assembly consists of a 10 feet 7-inch casing pup joint, the pod sleeve, the pod support ring, and 2 grub screws for securing the support ring in place. Here we see the pod hanger assembly. The main components of the hanger assembly are a lower 6-foot pup joint, the pod hanger, and an upper 6-foot pup joint with coupling. We will now conduct a pressure test to verify the integrity of the O-rings that provide a seal between the outer OD of the pod hanger and the pod sleeve. First, we will remove the support ring from the support sleeve. Remove the 2 set screws from the support ring. Back off the support ring from the pod sleeve. We will now temporarily install the pod hanger assembly into the pod sleeve assembly using a stabbing guide. Install the stabbing guide onto the sleeve. Pick up the hanger assembly and gently slide it into the pod sleeve. Remove the stabbing guide by unlatching the spring-loaded locking mechanism. Fully insert the pod hanger into the pod sleeve. Make up the support ring until wrench tight to secure the hanger assembly in position. Install the set screws into the support ring and torque to 15 feet-pounds. Use a hand pump to pressure test the pod hanger seals through the highlighted 1/4-inch NPT port. See section 4.5 of Tech Manual for test parameters. Once the test is complete, remove the set screws from the support ring and retain. Remove the support ring from the pod hanger. Carefully remove the hanger assembly from the pod sleeve. Prior to deployment, we must now install and set the orientation of the offset alignment sub. If available, place the pod hanger in a suitable Baker vise as shown. Take care to only grip the hanger diameter in the location shown, to avoid damage to critical surfaces and seals. Make up the offset union to the bottom end of the pod hanger. In this example, the offset union needs to be rotated through approximately 180 degrees to be in correct alignment with the pod hanger. Remove the set screws and retain for future use. Back off the locking ring and anti-rotation ring to allow free rotation of the bottom sub. Rotate the bottom sub to align as closely as possible with the center plane of the pod body. Re-engage the anti-rotation ring and secure with lock ring. Reinstall the set screws to secure the lock ring in position. Test install the MLE penetrator into the pod hanger body and make any preparations for length and termination per penetrator manufacturer's procedure. Finally, make up the discharge head to the offset union. We will now begin the process of deploying the pod system into the well. Here we see the lower pod assembly. Remove the 3.5-inch pin thread protector from the bottom of the lower pod assembly. Remove the 7-inch thread protector from the top of the bottom crossover assembly. If utilizing a standing valve, it can now be installed onto the no-go in the bottom crossover. This step can optionally be delayed until the run-in hole stage. Make up the lift nubbin to the top of the bottom crossover assembly. Pick up the pod bottom crossover assembly with the elevators and make up to the tailpipe, located in the 3.5-inch tubing slips. Pick up the weight of the string with the elevators and remove the 3.5-inch tubing slips. Lower the string to a working height and secure with 7-inch casing slips. Release and remove the elevators to gain access to the lift nubbin. Remove the lift nubbin from the pod bottom crossover assembly. Locate the first length of 30-foot pod casing and make up the lift nubbin. Pick up the first length of 30-foot pod casing with the elevators and make up to the pod bottom crossover assembly. Remove the 7-inch casing slips and lower the top of the 30-foot pod casing to working height. Secure the first length of pod casing with 7-inch casing slips. Release and remove the elevators to gain access to the lift nubbin. Remove the lift nubbin from the pod casing. Locate the second length of 30-foot pod casing and make up the lift nubbin. Pick up the second length of 30-foot pod casing with the elevators and make up to the first length of pod casing. Remove the 7-inch casing slips and lower the top of the second length of 30-foot pod casing to working height. Secure the second length of pod casing with 7-inch casing slips. Release and remove the elevators to gain access to the lift nubbin. Remove the lift nubbin from the pod casing. Locate the third length of 30-foot pod casing and make up the lift nubbin. Pick up the third length of 30-foot pod casing with the elevators and make up to the second length of pod casing. Remove the 7-inch casing slips and lower the top of the third length of 30-foot pod casing to a working height. Secure the third length of pod casing with 7-inch casing slips. Release and remove the elevators to gain access to the lift nubbin. Remove the lift nubbin from the pod casing. Locate the pod sleeve assembly and remove the 10 feet 7-inch casing sub. Make up the lift nubbin to the 10-foot casing sub. Pick up the 10-foot casing sub with the elevators and make up to the third length of pod casing. Remove the casing slips and lower the top of the 10-foot sub to working height. Secure the 10-foot casing sub with 7-inch casing slips. Release and remove the elevators to gain access to the lift nubbin. Remove the lift nubbin from the 10-foot casing sub. If not previously installed, run a standing valve into the casing until it lands on the no-go within the bottom crossover assembly. Jar down to fully seat the standing valve and release the running tool so it can be retrieved to surface. Make up the pod sleeve, complete with pod support ring, to the 10-foot sub. Remove the pod support ring to facilitate installation of the pressure test sub. Pick up the test sub in the tubing elevators and install onto the pod sleeve. Remove the slips and lower the top of the pressure test assembly to working height. Secure the string with tubing slips. Remove the elevators to facilitate the installation of a test cap. Fit the appropriate test cap and carry out pressure test. After the completion of a successful pressure test, pick up the weight of the string with the elevators. Remove the tubing slips. Pick up the string so that the top of the pod sleeve assembly is at working height. Install the 7-inch casing slips. Break out the pressure test sub from the string and remove from the elevators. Retrieve the previously installed standing valve. Install the work table onto the pod sleeve, aligning the open section with the MLE spooler. Pick up the first section of ESP and position above the table. Fit the discharge pressure line to the gauge and retain with MLE clamp. Lower the ESP into the well until the lifting clamp lands on the table. Remove the lifting slings. Pick up the second section of ESP and bolt it onto the first ESP section. At this point, you may need to ensure that the MLE cable and penetrator are fed through the pod body and support ring. This will be entirely dependent on the type of penetrator and the penetrator manufacturer's installation procedure. Pick up the weight of the string and remove the lifting clamp. Pick up further to gain access to the MLE pot head. Install the MLE cable. Install an MLE clamp to retain both the MLE cable and the discharge pressure line. Lower the string and install the second MLE clamp. Continue to lower the string until the ESP lifting clamp lands on the table. Remove the lifting slings. Pick up the final section of ESP. Lower the final section into position and bolt it onto the second ESP section. Remove the lifting clamp. Lower the ESP slightly and install an MLE clamp in the location just above the intake. Lower the ESP until the lifting clamp lands on the table. Remove the lifting slings. Install the discharge pressure sub. Locate the previously assembled hanger assembly and place the support ring over the upper pup joint, taking care to ensure that the ring is in the correct orientation. Pick up the hanger assembly with the elevators and install onto the discharge pressure sub. Pick up the string weight on the elevators and remove the lifting clamp. Install the discharge pressure line into the discharge pressure sub. Secure the MLE cable with an MLE clamp located onto the discharge head. Lower the string until the main body of the hanger assembly is at working height. Install the penetrator into the hanger as per the manufacturer's instructions. Remove the table. Install the stabbing guide onto the pod sleeve. Carefully lower the hanger into the pod sleeve until semi-installed, using the stabbing guide for centralization. remove the stabbing guide. Lower the string to fully land the pod hanger in the sleeve. Make up the support ring to the pod to lock the hanger body in position. Secure the support ring with 2 set screws. Connect the cable to the penetrator and complete any procedural tasks as per the penetrator manufacturer's instructions. Remove the 1/4 inch NPT plug as shown and repeat the pressure test carried out previously in the workshop. Upon completion of a successful pressure test, replace the 1/4 inch NPT plug. Pick up on the elevators and remove the dog collar and slips. The sealed pod and ESP deployment sequence is now complete, and the string can be run in the hole. For more information about our sealed pod systems, please visit our website.